My name is Miss Marple. Welcome to my new case.
It was one of those still afternoons in St. Mary Mead when the world outside seemed hushed under a pale, silvery sky. Miss Marple sat by her window with her knitting, her needles clicking softly in that steady rhythm that was as familiar to her as breathing. The quiet was broken only by the distant call of a milk cart and the occasional chirp of sparrows nesting in the ivy that trailed along the cottage walls. She was growing older. She admitted that to herself with a quiet honesty, but her mind had not lost its sharpness, nor her curiosity its edge. So when the doorbell rang, sharp and unexpected, she laid her knitting aside without surprise, almost as though she had been waiting for it. Visitors, she thought, often arrived in the lives of others with apparent spontaneity but with a secret inevitability. And when the maid opened the door and ushered in Ruth van Riedak, Miss Marple felt the delicate stirrings of that inevitability at once. Ruth van Riedak was a woman who carried with her a kind of presence that drew attention without asking for it. Tall, impeccably dressed, her gray hair set neatly under a small but expensive hat, she seemed a contrast to the quiet simplicity of Miss Marple's cottage. She lowered herself into the armchair opposite, her gloves still in her hand, and regarded her old friend with eyes that seemed anxious despite her carefully composed expression. "My dear Jane," Ruth began, her voice warm but threaded with urgency. "It has been far too long." Miss Marple smiled in that gentle way of hers, her blue eyes twinkling with a welcome that was both kind and perceptive. "Indeed, Ruth, it has. You are looking wonderfully well, though I can see something troubles you." Ruth gave a small laugh, though there was no real humor in it. "You always could see straight through me. Yes, I am troubled, and it is precisely why I have come. It's about Carrie Louise." At that name, something soft flickered across Miss Marple's face. She remembered Carrie Louise, the delicate beauty she had once known, now grown older, no doubt, but still carrying that aura of gentleness and kindness that had always set her apart. "She is well, I hope?" "That," said Ruth firmly, leaning forward, "is exactly what I cannot be sure of." The knitting lay forgotten in Miss Marple's lap as she listened. Ruth's voice, usually so poised, carried an undercurrent of genuine worry. She spoke of Carrie Louise living at Stonygates, the old manor house converted into something rather unconventional, a place where delinquent boys were reformed under the guidance of her husband, Louis Saracold. It was, Ruth said, a noble venture, but one fraught with unease. "I cannot explain it properly," Ruth admitted, her hands tightening around her gloves. "When I visit her, everything seems off. Not wrong in an obvious way, you understand, but there's a kind of atmosphere I cannot dismiss. I feel as though she is in danger, but of what or from whom I cannot tell." Miss Marple inclined her head, her expression grave yet attentive. "And you want me to go to her?" "Yes," Ruth said at once, relief flickering in her eyes. "You see, Jane, you have that mind, that way of noticing what others overlook. You always did. If there is something wrong at Stonygates, you will see it where I cannot." For a moment the silence stretched between them, filled only by the ticking of the little clock on the mantelpiece. Miss Marple reached for her knitting again, her fingers moving automatically as she thought. It was true. Her age was advancing and journeys were not so easy as they once had been. Yet her mind thrilled at the prospect of a puzzle, of an undercurrent hidden beneath the surface of ordinary life. "Tell me more," she said quietly, and Ruth did. She spoke of Carrie Louise's health, of the stepchildren and relations who came and went at Stonygates, each with their own interests and temperaments. She described Gina, the beautiful granddaughter who had returned from America with a brash young husband. She spoke of Christian Gulbrandsen, one of the trustees of the estate, and of Louis Saracold himself, devoted to his work, almost to the exclusion of his wife. "It is not one thing alone," Ruth confessed, lowering her voice. "It is a collection of small impressions. Glances exchanged, conversations cut short when I enter a room, a kind of tension in the air, as though something were brewing beneath the surface. And Carrie Louise, dear Carrie Louise, she seems as though she does not notice or perhaps refuses to. She is so trusting, so full of belief in others' goodness. It makes her blind, Jane, blind to danger." Miss Marple said nothing for a while. She sat knitting, her eyes fixed not on her work but on some inner horizon. She understood what Ruth meant. She had seen many times how those with the gentlest of hearts often became the most vulnerable. At length she looked up, her decision made with that quiet certainty that defined her. "Very well, Ruth. I will go to Stonygates." Ruth let out a breath that was half relief, half gratitude. "Oh, Jane, I knew you would. I cannot tell you how much it means. Perhaps nothing is wrong. Perhaps it is only my imagination. But if it is not, if there truly is something amiss, then Carrie Louise needs you." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "One must never dismiss the stirrings of intuition, my dear. More often than not, they prove quite correct." The afternoon light shifted across the room, and outside the sparrows scattered with a sudden flurry of wings. Within the small cottage, the course of events was quietly set into motion. Miss Marple would travel to Stonygates, and with her would go that unassuming, sharp-eyed perception that had unmasked so many secrets before. For now, though she offered Ruth tea, and the two old friends sat together, the air between them filled with unspoken concerns, and somewhere far from the safety of St. Mary Mead, Stonygates waited, its grand old walls holding not only a reform school, but a tangle of lives and motives, shadows and secrets, all poised to unfold. The decision once made, Miss Marple wasted little time in setting her affairs in order for the short journey that lay ahead. She was not by nature a traveler, and she had long ceased to find delight in the inconveniences of trains and changing timetables. Yet the thought of Carrie Louise, gentle and fragile, overshadowed by the faint but insistent alarm in Ruth's voice, pressed her forward with determination. She rose early on the morning of her departure, her cottage quiet in the thin blue dawn. The little garden outside was still beaded with dew, its autumn flowers bowing under the weight of moisture, and a robin trilled briefly on the gate before flitting away. She packed with the care of one who did not expect extravagances on the road, a small neat case, a sensible hat, and the inevitable knitting. A long train journey, after all, was best endured with something useful for the hands. The maid fussed a little at seeing her mistress off, and the village postman, passing by, tipped his cap with a kind word about the weather being set fair. Miss Marple responded with her usual gentle courtesy, but her thoughts were already far ahead, picturing the looming shape of Stonygates, the faces of those she was yet to meet, and the invisible threads of tension Ruth had spoken of. The train, when she boarded it, was comfortably quiet. Miss Marple settled herself into a corner seat, her case stowed safely above, and drew out her knitting. She watched her fellow passengers with that mild, almost absent-minded interest which masked a keen attention. A mother with a fretful child, a young man burying himself in his newspaper, two middle-aged ladies conversing in low but animated tones. It was all part of the fabric of life that never failed to intrigue her. People, she reflected, were so often absorbed in themselves, unaware of the tales their expressions and gestures told to a careful observer. The countryside slipped by beyond the window, fields fading into woodland, villages with their clustered cottages, church spires rising white against the sky. Her needles clicked steadily, but her mind was weaving threads of another sort. She thought of Carrie Louise, of Ruth's insistence that something was amiss. What kind of danger could nestle within a house devoted to reform and improvement? Was it financial mismanagement? The threat of violence from one of the boys housed there? Or, Miss Marple paused on this thought, was it something far subtler, a danger that arose not from strangers but from those within the circle of family itself? By the time the train slowed into the larger junction where she was to change, the day had grown brighter. Miss Marple disembarked with care, her case in one hand, her knitting tucked away, and glanced about with the air of someone who took in far more than she appeared to. She found the correct platform, settled again, and resumed her journey. It was late afternoon when she finally saw the countryside change to the broader, wooded stretches that she knew surrounded Stonygates. The air here had a different quality, still country, but touched with the lingering grandeur of old estates and avenues of trees planted centuries ago. When at last the train drew into the small rural station nearest to the house, Miss Marple stepped down, feeling the stiffness in her joints but steady in her purpose. Waiting for her was a car, old but well kept, and the driver, a pleasant middle-aged man in uniform livery, touched his cap respectfully as he took her case. "From Stonygates, ma'am. Mr. Saracold sent me." Miss Marple thanked him with quiet civility and allowed herself to be driven away from the station. The road wound through woodland and open parkland, the autumn colors flaming red and gold in the slanting sunlight. She sat back, her hands folded neatly in her lap, and allowed her eyes to absorb the approaching house. Stonygates stood on a rise, its stone walls mellow with age, its many windows glinting faintly. It was a house that had once been grand, perhaps even imposing, but now had the slightly faded air of many such country seats, pressed into new purposes by changing times. As the car turned into the sweeping drive, Miss Marple saw the neat lawns, the beds of late dahlias, and beyond, a glimpse of outbuildings that must serve the institution Louis Sericold had established. She was helped from the car at the great front door, which stood open in welcome. Within moments she was ushered into a hall that carried with it the echo of former grandeur, a sweeping staircase, portraits dimmed with age, the scent of polished wood. And then, at the top of the steps she saw Carrie Louise. Her old friend descended slowly, her hand lightly touching the banister, her figure still slender, her face delicate, though touched now by the marks of time. Yet the sweetness in her expression remained unchanged, the same soft smile that Miss Marple remembered. "My dear Jane," Carrie Louise exclaimed, reaching her at the foot of the stairs. "What a joy to see you again after all these years." The two embraced warmly, and Miss Marple studied her friend with quiet attentiveness. There was fragility, yes, a certain air of weariness, but also an undimmed kindness that shone through. "I cannot tell you how pleased I am to be here," Miss Marple replied. "It has been too long." Carrie Louise took her arm and led her through into a drawing room where tea was laid out. The room, though comfortable, bore evidence of its altered role. Papers and books on social reform shared space with cushions and flowers. "Louis will be here shortly," Carrie Louise said. "He was with some of the boys, but I would not let him delay greeting you for long." Miss Marple allowed herself to be seated, taking in the room, the furnishings, the small details that spoke of both domestic life and institutional order. And as she did, she felt again that ripple of anticipation, as though beneath the gracious welcome and the familiar affection, the house itself held its breath, waiting. The tea had barely been poured when the sound of footsteps came from the corridor, brisk and purposeful, a man's tread that carried with it a weight of energy. Louis Sericold entered the room almost at once, tall, spare, with an intensity that seemed to radiate from him even before he spoke. His eyes lit up with genuine warmth when he saw Miss Marple, yet there was a restlessness about him, as though his thoughts were always half-turned elsewhere. "My dear Miss Marple," he exclaimed, clasping her hand in a grip that was firm but distracted. "Carrie Louise has spoken so much of you. It is a great privilege to have you here at Stonygates." Miss Marple returned the greeting with mild composure. "It is kind of you to receive me, Mr. Sericold. I have heard of the admirable work you are doing here." His face brightened at once, and he began to speak of the reform school with an enthusiasm that seemed to pour from every fiber of him. He spoke of the boys, troubled, misguided, yet in his eyes brimming with potential if only guided correctly. He described programs of education, the value of discipline tempered with kindness, the future of social progress. Miss Marple listened politely, her small hands folded neatly in her lap. She admired in her quiet way the zeal of a man so thoroughly dedicated to a cause. Yet even in these first few moments she observed something. The way his voice quickened as he spoke of his work. The way his gaze slid from Carrie Louise when he talked, as though the woman at his side were secondary to the vision that consumed him. Tea was served, and they sat together for a while, the conversation turning from generalities to the details of life at Stonygates. Soon others began to drift into the room. A young woman appeared first, strikingly pretty, her dark hair glossy, her movements quick and impatient. She came straight to Carrie Louise, kissing her cheek lightly before turning her gaze on Miss Marple with a smile that was both polite and faintly amused. "This is Gina," Carrie Louise said warmly. "My granddaughter. She has only recently come from America." Gina's smile widened. "And I've brought Walter with me, of course," she added, glancing toward the door where a young man now stood, his stance awkward, his expression faintly sullen. Walter was broad-shouldered, with the look of someone unused to refinement, his manner betraying both irritation and unease at the company he found himself among. Miss Marple inclined her head toward them both, her mind filing away the contrast between Gina's lively confidence and Walter's resentment. It was, she thought, often the way when a marriage was built more on impulse than on steady ground. A few more relatives made their appearances in turn. Mildred, Carrie Louise's daughter from her first marriage, a woman of heavy features and a perpetual air of grievance, who spoke with a kind of determined dullness, and Alex Restorick, another of Carrie Louise's stepsons, urbane and smiling, his charm sitting a little too easily on him, like a suit too well tailored to be entirely trusted. They gathered in the drawing room, a small collection of family whose ties to one another were tangled by marriages and step relations, half-blood and whole, connections stretching back across years and complicated histories. And through it all, Miss Marple sat quietly, observing, her needles clicking faintly as she took up her knitting once more. She noted the way Mildred's eyes flicked toward Gina with faint disapproval, the way Gina leaned closer to Walter only to sigh when he responded with monosyllables, the way Alex's charm was deployed as if it were a weapon, disarming and deflecting in equal measure. Dinner that evening was served in a dining room whose long table bore witness to generations of family before them. The atmosphere was on the surface amiable enough. Louis talked animatedly of his plans for the expansion of the institution. Carrie Louise smiled gently, her gaze lingering on her husband with an affection that seemed blind to the fact that his thoughts scarcely touched her. Mildred contributed little beyond an occasional complaint about her health or the servants. Gina and Walter exchanged looks, hers bright with challenge, his heavy with irritation. Alex played the part of genial commentator, smoothing over small frictions with a practiced ease. Miss Marple spoke little, though she answered when addressed with that mild courtesy that made people forget she was listening at all. Yet she listened to every word, every pause, every silence that filled the spaces between sentences. Beneath the surface of the evening meal, she felt the tension Ruth had spoken of, a web of undercurrents running silently but unmistakably through the room. Later, when she was shown to her guest room, Miss Marple paused by the window before retiring. The grounds of Stonygates lay quiet under the starlit sky. Somewhere beyond the main house, lights glowed faintly in the outbuildings where the reform school operated. She thought of the boys Ruth had described, troubled youths brought here for correction. What passions, what tempers might be harbored there? And what risks might such an enterprise bring into the heart of the household itself? Yet even more than that, she thought of the family. In her long years, Miss Marple had learned that danger often came not from the strangers at the gate, but from the tensions within the walls themselves. She saw already the hints of discontent, the subtle frictions that spoke of jealousy, resentment, and concealed motives. She drew the curtains closed, turned down the bed, and set her knitting neatly aside. Tomorrow, she told herself, would bring further opportunities to observe. And if there was indeed something wrong at Stonygates, it would soon reveal itself, not in grand gestures but in the smallest of details. For it was always in the details that truth lived, waiting to be noticed by the right eyes, and Miss Marple's eyes, though mild and seemingly vague, missed very little indeed. The night passed quietly, yet Miss Marple did not sleep as soundly as she usually did in her own familiar bed at St. Mary Mead. There was something about great houses, such as Stonygates, she reflected, that carried a sense of weight, as though the very walls remembered all the generations who had lived and quarreled and loved within them. A creak along the corridor, the far-off slam of a door, the echo of voices carried up from below. These small noises wove themselves into her light sleep, so that when she woke at dawn she felt as though she had been half listening all night. She rose early, drawing the curtains to let in the pale morning light. The grounds below were wrapped in a faint mist that softened the outlines of trees and lawns. Somewhere in the distance a bell rang, sharp and insistent, and Miss Marple wondered if it marked the beginning of the boys' daily routine. She dressed with her usual neatness, fastening her collar with a small brooch, and went downstairs, guided by her instinct to see a house in its first stirrings of the day, when masks were not yet fully in place. In the breakfast room, she found Carrie Louise already seated, a shawl draped lightly around her shoulders. She was stirring her tea absent-mindedly, her gaze resting on the garden beyond the window. When she turned to greet Miss Marple, her smile was warm, but there was a faint shadow in her eyes as though some inner thought lingered. "You are an early riser, Jane," she said gently. "I had forgotten how you always liked to see the world before it fully woke." "It tells you a good deal about people," Miss Marple replied. "The morning is very honest." Carrie Louise gave a little laugh, then sighed. "Louis will join us shortly. He has been with the boys already. He insists on seeing them at first light." I do not know how he manages it. His energy is boundless. Miss Marple nodded, though she kept her thoughts to herself. She had seen men like Lewis before, men whose passion for a cause burned so fiercely that it consumed not only their own strength, but also the attention they owed to those closest to them. It was admirable, yes, but it carried a danger too. The danger of neglecting the quiet needs of a wife, of failing to see when shadows gathered too close. One by one, others drifted into the room. Mildred entered with her habitual heaviness, her mouth already pursed in mild complaint about the chill of the morning. Gina swept in soon after, vivid as ever, her voice bright and careless as she greeted everyone, while Walter followed behind with a scowl that deepened when he caught sight of Alex already at the table, his smile easy and practiced as he offered some light remark that drew a laugh from Gina. The meal unfolded with that curious mixture of domesticity and tension that Miss Marple had already noted the night before. Conversation flickered across the table, sometimes lively, sometimes stilted, always with undercurrents that ran deeper than the words themselves. Lewis arrived last, his manner brisk and cheerful, his face alight with enthusiasm as he spoke of a boy who had shown promise in his work that morning. He barely touched his food, talking more than eating, his attention straying often to his vision of reform rather than to the family gathered before him. Miss Marple ate little but listened much. She noticed how Walter's shoulders tightened whenever Gina laughed too freely at Alex's remarks, how Mildred's eyes lingered critically on Gina's bright clothes, her expression set in disapproval, how Carrie Louise, for all her gentle composure, seemed to withdraw into silence whenever voices grew sharper. It was as though she sought always to soothe, to smooth over, to prevent discord, but in doing so, she faded into the background, unnoticed by those who should have cherished her most. After breakfast, Lewis offered to show Miss Marple the work of the institution. She accepted readily, for she knew that to understand the atmosphere of Stonygates she must see not only its drawing rooms but also the enterprise that shaped its daily life. He led her across the grounds to the outbuildings where the boys lived and worked. The place was orderly, with a strict but not unkind regime. Boys in uniform moved briskly about their tasks, some glancing curiously at the small elderly woman walking with their patron. Lewis spoke eagerly of his methods of discipline balanced with opportunity, of training that would equip these youths for honest lives beyond these walls. His words rang with conviction, and Miss Marple could not doubt the sincerity of his devotion. Yet as she watched, she saw too the other side, the sullenness in some faces, the quick flash of hostility in a boy's eyes when he thought himself unobserved, the way the warder's hand sometimes lingered a little too firmly on a shoulder to keep order. "Splendid work. I think you'll agree," Lewis said, his gaze bright with pride. "It is certainly ambitious," Miss Marple answered softly. She let the word hang in the air. Neither praise nor criticism, merely an observation. As they returned to the main house, Miss Marple fell into quiet thought. She was not blind to the good that might come of such reform, yet she wondered at the risks too. A house that sheltered both a family and a body of restless young men. It was a curious combination, one that might breed tension in unexpected ways. Later that morning, Miss Marple found herself alone with Gina in the garden. The younger woman was lively, her speech tumbling out in a mixture of English and American turns of phrase, her laughter bright. Yet there was a sharpness beneath her gaiety, a quick impatience that betrayed itself when she spoke of Walter. "He doesn't fit in here," she said suddenly, tossing her head. "He doesn't understand people like Alex or Lewis. He just broods, sulks. I try to help him, but really, Aunt Carrie's world is too much for him." Miss Marple murmured something non-committal, her gaze resting on Gina's expressive face. She wondered if the girl realized how her words, so freely spoken, might cut into her husband's pride. When Gina flitted away, leaving the faint scent of her perfume in the air, Miss Marple remained seated on the bench, her knitting in her lap. She had seen enough families to know how such cracks widened, resentment feeding upon neglect, jealousy upon charm, irritation upon thoughtless words. And she thought again of Ruth's warning, that something was wrong here, though it was not yet clear what form the wrongness took. By the time luncheon was served, Miss Marple felt she had already begun to understand the outlines of the household. Yet outlines were not enough. It was in the shadows and the small overlooked details that the truth lived. And she had no doubt that at Stonygates truth and danger were closely entwined, waiting for the moment when they would step into the light. The afternoon deepened into a mellow stillness, and Miss Marple found herself once again observing the household in its natural rhythms. The mist that had clung to the lawns in the morning had burned away, leaving the air bright but cool, the light slanting golden through the tall windows of Stonygates. She sat in the drawing room with her knitting, a picture of domestic tranquility, while around her the family shifted about their separate occupations. Yet beneath that calm exterior there was an undertone, a faint dissonance she could not ignore, like the single string out of tune in an orchestra. Mildred had stationed herself in a corner, speaking occasionally of her health, her grievances, her sense of being overlooked. She directed her words chiefly at Miss Marple, perhaps because she sensed in her a patient listener. Gina, meanwhile, moved restlessly through the room, bright and sparkling in her manner, her laughter sudden and sharp. Walter entered now and again, standing awkwardly at the threshold, never quite at ease. His eyes clouded when they fell on his wife's animated face as she conversed with Alex. Alex himself leaned easily against the mantelpiece, charming, smooth, his conversation light but edged with something practiced. Miss Marple's needles clicked gently. She contributed little, but she missed nothing. She noted the way Gina's hand lingered a fraction too long on Alex's sleeve when she laughed at his remark. The tightening of Walter's jaw as he turned away, the flicker of disapproval in Mildred's eyes as she watched. Carrie Louise, for her part, sat with her hands folded, smiling faintly at them all, as though her greatest desire were to keep peace and harmony, even if that meant ignoring what lay beneath the surface. Louis, as always, came and went with the energy of a man forever driven by his cause. He stopped to kiss his wife's cheek, to say a word or two to Miss Marple, but his mind was elsewhere. His talk was of reforms, of opportunities, of the future. He was like a man possessed, blazing a trail only he could see, and all others were left in his wake, straining to follow or left behind entirely. The hours passed, the light faded, and soon the family gathered again for the evening meal. It was a curious repetition of the night before, yet subtly altered. The small tensions had sharpened. Walter drank more heavily than was wise and spoke with an edge that was near insolent. Gina countered him with a flash of temper, her voice quick and mocking. Mildred's complaints grew louder, her tone more insistent, as though she resented being ignored. Alex smoothed things over with practiced ease, yet his smile seemed almost to enjoy the discord he calmed. Carrie Louise intervened softly, urging them toward peace, but her voice carried little weight. Miss Marple, silent at the far end of the table, sipped her soup and let her eyes drift from one face to another. She saw the spark in Gina's eyes when Alex leaned close, the tightening of Walter's grip on his glass, the weary droop of Carrie Louise's shoulders when her words went unheeded. She saw, too, the subtle way Louis brushed aside all conversation not connected with his work, as though the private lives and private pains of his household were too trivial to command his notice. After dinner, the party dispersed. Some went to the library, others to the sitting room. Miss Marple excused herself and wandered the corridors, her steps unhurried, her eyes lingering on portraits and old furniture, the remnants of centuries of family life. She had always believed that houses held memories, that the walls absorbed the essence of those who lived within them. Stonygates seemed heavy with such impressions, though whether of harmony or of discord she could not yet be sure. It was in one of the long corridors that she came upon Walter, standing alone, his hands thrust deep in his pockets, his face dark with brooding. He started slightly when he saw her, then gave a stiff nod. "You'll think I don't belong here," he said abruptly. Miss Marple regarded him with mild eyes. "Belonging is often a question of making the place your own. It takes patience," he gave a short, bitter laugh. "Patience isn't much use when your wife's got her head turned by another man. Don't think I don't see it. Alex, he's always hanging about, making jokes, flattering her. She eats it up. And me, what am I? Nothing." Miss Marple's gaze remained steady, kind but penetrating. "Marriage," she said gently, "requires two people to look toward one another, not away. If one is distracted, the other must steady the balance. Anger often tips it further." Walter's shoulders sagged, his anger blunting into weariness. "I don't know if I can," he muttered. "This place, it's not for me. All these people, all this talk, I don't fit." Miss Marple laid a small hand lightly on his arm. "Fitting in is not so important as being true to what you are. But do not let jealousy blind you. It seldom sees the truth clearly. He muttered something indistinct and moved away, leaving Miss Marple standing in the dim corridor. She watched him go, her expression thoughtful. She had seen jealousy destroy many things in her long life. Friendships, marriages, even lives. It was a dangerous seed, and here at Stonygates it seemed already planted, its shoots beginning to show. She returned to her room later, her mind busy with all she had observed. The household was a web, each person entangled with the others, each bearing some hidden burden or secret discontent. Carrie Louise, gentle and trusting, seemed blind to it all. Louis, consumed by his cause, noticed nothing but his work. And the younger generation, Gina with her restless charm, Walter with his wounded pride, Alex with his easy grace, all of them played their parts in a drama that had yet to reach its climax. Miss Marple placed her knitting carefully on the bedside table and extinguished the lamp. Yet long after the house had settled into silence, she lay awake, listening to the faint creaks and sighs of the old manor, wondering what shape the trouble would take when it finally broke the surface. She was certain of one thing: Ruth had been right. There was danger here. It had not yet shown its face, but it was near, moving in the shadows, biding its time. The morning after was clear and sharp, the kind of day when the air itself seemed to sparkle with a hidden edge. Miss Marple rose earlier than most, her habit of light sleeping leaving her with hours before the household fully stirred. She looked out at the lawns where the dew clung like silver beads to the grass and watched a gardener trundling a wheelbarrow across the gravel. There was a peace to the scene, but Miss Marple knew well enough how deceptive such appearances could be. A quiet surface was often only the mask of restless waters beneath. When she went down, the house had not yet gathered itself into full activity. Carrie Louise was again at breakfast, smiling faintly at her friend's punctuality. Louis had already been gone for hours, so she said, at the school buildings, speaking to instructors and wardens, his voice already ringing across the grounds, before the rest of the household had even opened their eyes. Miss Marple took her seat, allowing the familiar rhythm of pouring tea and buttering toast to steady the conversation. There was talk of plans for the day. Carrie Louise mentioned visitors expected from among the trustees of the institution, a reminder of the constant administrative weight that accompanied Louis's projects. Christian Gulbrandsen may come later, she said softly with that gentle, unassuming smile of hers. He is always such a support to Louis, though his manner is sometimes rather stiff. Miss Marple inclined her head, filing away the name as she did every name. It was her way. Nothing dismissed, nothing forgotten. Every person carried with them the possibility of significance, though the moment of their importance might not yet have come. By the time the rest of the family gathered, the house seemed to swell with sound again. Mildred's complaints, Gina's laughter, Walter's silence, Alex's suave remarks. All of it, Miss Marple thought, was like a play unfolding on a stage, each actor falling into familiar lines, repeating them day after day, waiting only for some sudden disruption to shift the performance into a tragedy. That disruption came sooner than even Miss Marple had expected. The morning wore on, and Miss Marple accompanied Carrie Louise on a gentle walk through the gardens. They spoke of small things at first: the roses, the difficulties of keeping servants in the country, the peculiarities of village life. Yet, Carrie Louise's voice, kind though it was, carried a faint tremor of weariness. There were times when her words drifted away, as though her mind had slipped from the present moment into some private fog. I sometimes feel, she admitted softly, that I am not entirely, how shall I put it, in step with the rest. Louis does so much, his mind is always moving, and I cannot always follow. But he is so good, so devoted to me, Jane. You must see that. He devotes everything to me, to my happiness, even when I cannot quite grasp it myself. Miss Marple's gaze rested gently on her old friend's face. She heard the words, but also the silences within them, the things not said. Devotion could be a strange thing, she thought. It could give greatly, and it could also conceal. She asked no questions then, only nodded, and steered the conversation back to safer ground. It was late in the morning when a sudden commotion rippled through the house. Miss Marple and Carrie Louise, returning from the garden, heard hurried footsteps, raised voices, a note of alarm. They entered the hall to find Walter, pale and shaken, gesturing wildly while Alex tried to calm him with that practiced charm which now seemed strained. "It was a shot," Walter insisted, his voice hoarse. "I heard it. In the library." The word "shot" carried through the hall like the crack of a whip. For a moment, time seemed to hang suspended. Then Lewis appeared, striding quickly, from the direction of the school buildings, his face intent, his voice commanding. "What is this?" "There was a shot," Walter repeated, and this time others echoed him. Mildred, who had heard the echo from her sitting room. Gina, who had come running, her eyes wide with alarm. Lewis's expression hardened. "Stay here," he ordered, and strode toward the library. Miss Marple, however, moved forward quietly, unobtrusively, her small figure slipping into the group that followed. She knew better than to stay behind when danger stirred the air. The library door was half open, and within, the smell of gunpowder lingered faintly, acrid against the polished wood and leather-bound books. On the carpet lay Christian Gulbrandsen, his body crumpled, a dark stain spreading across his coat. He was very still. Too still. Carrie Louise gave a faint cry, her hand flying to her mouth, while Gina clutched at Walter's arm. Alex muttered, something under his breath, his charm deserted, his face suddenly sharp and calculating. Mildred began to wail, her voice shrill. Miss Marple stepped closer, her gaze sweeping the room, not with horror but with a calm, unflinching attention. She saw the position of the body, the angle of the fallen chair, the papers scattered on the desk. She noticed the absence of any weapon nearby. She noted, too, the look that flashed across Louis Saracold's face before he mastered it. A look not of shock, but of something colder, harder, a recognition, perhaps. "He's dead," Louis said at last, his voice firm. "There's nothing to be done." The household erupted into confusion then, questions, protests, half-formed accusations. Who could have fired the shot? Where was the gun? Was it one of the boys from the institution? Was it someone within the family? Voices overlapped. Fear grew sharp-edged. Miss Marple, standing very still, let the storm of sound wash over her. She had seen this before, the way fear and suspicion spread like fire, leaping from one to another, consuming reason. But she knew that in such chaos lay the seeds of truth. People betrayed themselves when they were frightened. Their masks slipped and what lay beneath showed through. She turned her eyes from face to face, memorizing expressions, words, gestures. Gina's fear was real, but mingled with a strange excitement. Walter looked aghast, yet his anger had not vanished. Mildred wept noisily, but her eyes darted sideways, calculating who would listen. Alex kept his voice calm, but there was a glint in his eyes too sharp for mere concern. Louis stood apart, his energy focused, already taking command, already speaking of summoning the police, of controlling the situation. And Carrie Louise. Carrie Louise was pale, bewildered, her hands clasped tightly together, her lips moving soundlessly as though in prayer. Miss Marple saw it all and tucked it away, neat as stitches in her knitting. The shot had been fired. Christian Gulbrandsen lay dead in the library of Stonygates, and with his death the hidden currents of this house would begin to surge into the open, whether the family wished it or not. For in murder, as Miss Marple knew well, there was no concealing the truth forever. It always seeped through in words and glances, in the careless betrayals of the frightened and the guilty, and she would be there to see it. The silence after Lewis's pronouncement hung heavily in the library, a silence that seemed louder than the frantic chorus that had filled the room only moments before. The faint ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece suddenly became prominent, each beat striking through the charged atmosphere. No one moved at first, as if they were suspended in the stillness of that moment. All eyes fixed upon the crumpled body of Christian Gulbrandsen. Miss Marple, standing near the desk, allowed her gaze to travel slowly around the room again. The absence of the weapon disturbed her. It was too deliberate, too controlled. She had seen the aftermath of many crimes, and this particular detail spoke of calculation, not accident or impulse. Whoever had fired that shot had also had the presence of mind to remove the gun. That, in itself, was telling. Lewis's voice cut through the air, brisk and commanding. "We must notify the police at once. No one is to leave the house until they arrive. This is a grave matter, and it must be handled properly. He looked directly at Alex, whose smooth veneer returned as if it had never cracked. "Telephone Inspector Curry in the village. He'll know what to do." Alex nodded swiftly and left the room, his footsteps fading down the corridor. Walter muttered under his breath, pacing near the window, while Gina pressed a trembling hand to her lips, her eyes flickering between her husband and the door Alex had just passed through. Mildred had collapsed into a chair, her sobs growing louder, filling the space with their shrill cadence. Carrie Louise had not moved since her first cry. Her eyes were wide, fixed not on the body but on Louis, as though she sought reassurance from him alone. Miss Marple noticed this with the same quiet attention she gave to everything, tucking the observation neatly into her mental store. A quarter of an hour later, the police arrived. Inspector Curry was a solid, practical man with a calm demeanor that steadied the nerves of the household. He greeted Louis with respectful gravity, then looked toward the body. His manner was brisk but not unkind. He had the air of one accustomed to terrible sights, yet still human enough to feel the weight of them. Miss Marple had met many such men before, competent, sensible, but sometimes inclined to miss the subtler details that did not fit neatly into procedure. She resolved to keep her ears open and her presence unassuming, ready to catch what others overlooked. Curry's men examined the body, taking careful notes, and soon it was confirmed what everyone already knew. Christian Gulbranson was dead, killed by a single shot to the chest. No weapon had been found, and the windows were locked from within. It was murder, plain and stark. The inspector began his inquiries at once, questioning each member of the household in turn. Louis gave his account with crisp efficiency, his voice low but firm, emphasizing his concern for his wife and the unfortunate timing of Gulbranson's visit. Carrie Louise, when asked, spoke haltingly with confusion, her words wandering as though she could not quite fix her thoughts. Gina was flippant at first, then defensive, while Walter bristled, his resentment evident even in his responses to official questions. Mildred wept and wailed, speaking more of her own distress than of the crime itself, while Alex presented himself as the helpful intermediary, eager to assist. Miss Marple, when her turn came, spoke simply and quietly, recounting where she had been, what she had heard, what she had observed. She gave nothing more than was asked, but she saw Inspector Curry's eyes linger on her, weighing her, perhaps wondering at the calmness of this elderly visitor in the midst of such turmoil. By evening, the initial inquiries were complete, but the house remained under a cloud of unease. The family gathered once more in the drawing room, though the atmosphere was brittle, every word carefully measured, every glance edged with suspicion. The absence of Christian Gulbranson was a presence in itself, his death a shadow that lay across them all. Miss Marple sat quietly in her accustomed place, her knitting in her lap, though her fingers scarcely moved. She watched the others with eyes as sharp as needles, noting the little betrayals of expression, the ways in which fear showed itself. Louis spoke of the need for composure, for unity, for standing together in the face of misfortune. His words were noble, but Miss Marple thought she detected an undercurrent of something else, an urgency, almost a desperation, as though he needed control above all else. Carrie Louise nodded dutifully, smiling faintly, but the smile did not reach her eyes. Walter sat apart, brooding, his gaze fixed on Gina, who avoided his eyes with an effort that made her evasion all the more conspicuous. Alex, as ever, positioned himself gracefully in the center of things. His voice smooth, his manner charming, but his eyes, oh yes, his eyes were always watching, calculating, as though weighing how much he might gain or lose in this unexpected upheaval. Mildred's complaints grew louder with each passing hour, her voice rising in irritation at being overlooked, at not being given her due attention in such a crisis. She framed herself as the victim of neglect, as though the murder had been committed chiefly to disturb her peace. Miss Marple listened, storing every word away. She had no illusions. Murder, she knew, was rarely simple. It grew from seeds planted long before in jealousies, resentments, ambitions, and fears. Christian Gulbranson's death was not an isolated act. It was the culmination of something long in motion. The task now was to trace those lines back to their beginnings, to see where they led. When she retired to her room at last, she did not immediately prepare for bed. Instead, she sat at the small writing table and took out a sheet of paper. She made a few small notes, names, times, impressions. It was her habit, and it helped her arrange her thoughts. Beneath each name she wrote the tiniest hints of what she had seen. Gina, flirtation, restlessness, excitement. Walter, jealousy, bitterness. Alex, charm, calculation. Mildred, self-pity, complaint. Louis, control, urgency. Carrie Louise, confusion, fragility. At the bottom she wrote a single word, motive. She tapped the pen against the paper, her mind turning. Who had reason to wish Christian Gulbranson dead? What had he discovered, or what had he threatened? His role as a trustee, his influence over Louis's schemes, his connection to Carrie Louise. All of these might conceal reasons someone preferred him silenced. She put the pen down at last, extinguished the lamp, and sat in the dark for a moment longer. Outside, the wind stirred faintly through the trees, whispering against the old walls of Stonygates. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap and closed her eyes. Somewhere in this house, she thought, someone had blood on their hands, and before long their mask would slip. It always did. Inspector Curry returned early the next morning, his face grim, his manner businesslike. He had spent the night piecing together fragments from the household's testimonies, cross-checking times, movements, and accounts. Still, the central mystery remained. No one admitted to being in the library when the fatal shot was fired. And yet Christian Gulbranson had been murdered in what seemed almost a locked-room situation. Miss Marple had risen early herself, her mind restless from the images of the previous night. She was in the breakfast room when Curry arrived, seated quietly with her knitting, her teacup cooling beside her. She watched him speak with Louis, his voice low and steady, and she could almost feel the inspector's frustration. He had the manner of a man whose work was weighed down by too many conflicting details and not enough clarity. The family filtered in one by one, subdued, wary of speaking too freely in the presence of authority. Gina's brightness was dulled, though she still tried to make light conversation. Walter remained heavy-eyed and sullen. Alex spoke with his usual polish as though eager to demonstrate cooperation. Mildred carried her grievances like a badge, repeating her lamentations of being ignored. And Carrie Louise, pale and fragile, sat quietly by her husband, her hands clasped in her lap as though they alone anchored her. Inspector Curry addressed them all, his voice measured. Mr. Gulbranson came here last night unexpectedly. He was in possession of certain papers, which, according to what we found, concerned the management of the institution. Those papers are missing. Until we find them, or find who had reason to silence him, we will remain at an impasse. His gaze swept the room, lingering a fraction too long on each face. I ask again, did any of you see Mr. Gulbranson before dinner or after, before the shot was heard? The silence that followed was taut, the kind of silence that reveals more than it conceals. At last Alex spoke smoothly. I believe I saw him in the corridor just before dinner. He seemed rather preoccupied, but I thought little of it at the time. Preoccupied in what way? Curry asked. Alex spread his hands lightly. Distracted, thoughtful. Not unusual, I suppose, for a man of his responsibilities. Walter gave a short, derisive laugh. That's convenient. You see him and then he ends up dead, but you thought nothing of it. Very neat. Gina's voice snapped out, sharper than usual. Stop it, Walter. You always twist everything. Inspector, he can't mean Alex had anything to do with it. That's ridiculous. Walter turned on her with a bitterness that made his voice tremble. Ridiculous? You leap to defend him quickly enough, don't you? The tension rose, voices colliding until Louis's firm tone cut through. Enough! This is not the time for petty bickering. A man has been murdered. Miss Marple, silent at her end of the table, allowed her eyes to drift to Carrie Louise. She alone had not spoken, and in her silence lay a subtle distress that tugged at Miss Marple's attention. Carrie Louise's fingers trembled slightly on the edge of her napkin, her gaze unfocused as though she drifted in a fog while the storm of accusations swirled around her. Inspector Curry did not miss it either. He turned to her gently. Mrs. Saracle, did you see your brother before his death? Carrie Louise blinked, then shook her head slowly. I don't remember. He was here, wasn't he? Yes, I recall his smile, but it's so faint. Everything seems faint these days. Perhaps I spoke with him, but it slips from me. Her voice faded, and Louis's hand closed firmly over hers, steadying her. My wife is not in good health, he said shortly. She cannot be pressed in this manner. Inspector Curry inclined his head, but Miss Marple saw the calculation behind his eyes. Carrie Louise's vagueness might be genuine illness, or it might be a shield. In either case, it deepened the shadows of doubt. After breakfast, the inspector began more private interviews. Miss Marple, left for the moment in the drawing room, resumed her knitting, her needles clicking softly while her thoughts ranged far beyond the wool in her lap. She was not fooled by the surface of things. She had seen enough families to know how grievances hid themselves in polite words, how ambition cloaked itself in charm, how jealousy burned beneath silence. When Gina came into the room, restless and bright-eyed, Miss Marple looked up mildly. "My dear, you seem troubled." Gina laughed too quickly. "Who wouldn't be? It's all so ghastly. I can't bear the thought of being shut up here with everyone watching each other as though we were all guilty." "Sometimes," Miss Marple said gently, "those who protest most loudly about being watched are those who fear what might be seen." Gina's eyes flashed. A spark of anger there, but she smoothed it quickly. "I don't know what you mean. I've nothing to hide." She turned away, her hands clenching at her sides, and in that very insistence Miss Marple found confirmation, for those with nothing to hide seldom felt the need to say so. By afternoon, the household had sunk into a tense quiet, broken only by occasional murmurs of conversation. Miss Marple moved unobtrusively, sitting sometimes with Carrie Louise, sometimes pausing in the library where the body had been discovered. She studied the shelves, the placement of the desk, the faint outline of where Gulbranson's papers had lain before they vanished. Every detail mattered. In her experience, murder was often revealed by the small, overlooked things, the thread caught on a nail, the misplaced object, the sentence spoken without thought. Inspector Curry gathered them all once more before dinner. His face was grave. "I have learned one thing. Mr. Gulbranson intended to speak to someone in this house privately last night. He carried documents that may have concerned financial mismanagement or irregularities. Those documents are missing. Until they are found, every one of you remains under suspicion." The announcement fell like a stone into water, sending ripples of alarm across the room. Mildred wailed that she had nothing to do with such dreadful matters. Gina turned pale, her lips pressed tightly together. Walter glowered, muttering about being dragged into scandals that weren't his doing. Alex spread his hands, speaking smoothly of his desire to help in any way. Lewis's eyes flashed, hard and dangerous, before he masked them again. And Carrie Louise. Carrie Louise sat very still, as though she had retreated deep inside herself. Miss Marple sat quietly, her knitting motionless in her lap, her gaze moving from face to face. She had no doubt now. This was not simply a crime of passion nor a random act. It was deliberate, carefully executed, rooted in the secrets of this household and its affairs. The missing papers were the key, and somewhere among these people someone knew exactly where they were, and she, Jane Marple of St. Mary Mead, intended to find out. The evening shadows at Stonygates lengthened into an oppressive gloom, and though lamps had been lit in the corridors, the atmosphere was no lighter than it had been at the very hour of Christian Gulbranson's murder. Meals were taken in strained silence, conversations stumbled and faltered, and every glance seemed weighted with unspoken suspicion. The ordinary rhythm of life had been disrupted. Time itself felt altered, as though the house and all within it existed only within the confines of the crime, unable to step beyond it. Miss Marple, sitting quietly at the edge of the drawing room, let her hands fold idly in her lap while her mind worked tirelessly, each piece of the puzzle pressed against her thoughts. The missing papers, the oddly nervous looks exchanged between Lewis and Alex, Gina's troubled agitation, Walter's smoldering jealousy. They did not exist in isolation. All these tensions were threads of one great fabric, and though the weave was still hidden, Miss Marple was certain it would unravel soon, revealing the shape of truth beneath. That night, when most of the household had retired, she lingered in the corridor, listening. The silence of an old country house was rarely absolute. There were the groans of timber, the faint whisper of wind, the distant tick of a clock. But on this night the silence was deeper, as though everyone within held their breath. It was then that she heard it, a door opening softly, then closing again. Footsteps, light but hurried, passing along the carpeted passage. She rose at once, her slippered feet soundless, and followed at a distance. The figure ahead was cloaked in shadow, but the silhouette was unmistakably male. He carried something beneath his arm, a sheaf of papers perhaps, and moved with a furtiveness that betrayed his urgency. He disappeared into the library. Miss Marple moved no closer but waited, hidden in a darkened alcove, her heart steady but watchful. Minutes passed. She heard the faint scrape of a drawer, the soft rustle of paper, then the click of the door as the man left again, retreating by another passage. She waited until the sound of his steps had faded before slipping down toward the library herself. The room was dim, lit only by the dying embers of the fire. She went first to the desk where Gulbranson had sat, running her fingers lightly across the surface. The drawers were closed, yet one bore the faintest trace of disturbance, a keyhole glinting faintly in the light. She bent closer. It was locked now, but it had not been so only moments ago. Whoever had come had locked it behind him. When morning came, the house stirred with subdued apprehension. Inspector Curry was again at his post, his face graver than before. He spoke with the servants, then with members of the household. But his questions had a sharper edge, as though his patience with evasions had run thin. Miss Marple, summoned briefly to his side, mentioned quietly what she had observed. She did not speculate, but her report of footsteps in the night and the sound of drawers being opened was enough to sharpen his interest. He nodded grimly. That, Miss Marple, may be the very moment our missing papers changed hands. And if so, it tells us something vital. The murderer is not yet satisfied. He fears what might still be discovered. The day wore on with little relief. Meals were stiff, conversations faltered into silence. Carrie Louise, pale and fragile, drifted between rooms like a ghost, her eyes filled with uncomprehending sorrow. Louis hovered constantly near her, his protective manner almost exaggerated, and Miss Marple watched the way his hand lingered too often on her arm, the way he intercepted questions directed at her, answering them in her place. It was in the afternoon, while Miss Marple sat with her knitting in a sunny corner of the conservatory, that Gina entered, her movements quick and nervous. She sat opposite, her eyes darting about as though afraid of being overheard. "I can't stand it anymore," she burst out. "Walter won't look at me without suspicion, Alex as smug as ever, and Uncle Louis, oh, don't you see, it's unbearable. Everyone's pretending nothing's wrong, but we all know it is." Miss Marple's needles clicked gently. "You feel the strain very much, my dear. But sometimes in moments of strain, people show their true selves more clearly than they realize. One must observe carefully." Gina leaned forward, lowering her voice. "You think you know, don't you? You watch us all as if you see right through us. Tell me, is Walter right to be jealous of Alex? Do you think Alex—" She broke off abruptly, biting her lip. "No, I mustn't say it." Miss Marple looked at her with gentle gravity. "One must be cautious, yes. Words once spoken cannot be recalled. But let me give you this advice, child. Be honest with yourself, if not with others. You will need that honesty before long." Gina looked uncertain, then rose abruptly. "I feel as if the whole house is waiting for something dreadful. I almost wish it would come, to be done with it." Her words lingered in Miss Marple's mind, for they echoed her own thoughts. The household was indeed waiting, for revelation, for exposure, for the final act of a drama that had already begun. The revelation came sooner than expected. That night, shortly after the household had retired, a sudden cry rang out through the corridors. It was a woman's voice, shrill and frightened. Doors opened, footsteps hurried. Miss Marple, already wakeful, stepped swiftly from her room and joined the others rushing toward the sound. It came from Carrie Louise's chamber. The door was open, and inside they found her seated upright in bed, her eyes wide with terror, her hands clutching at the coverlet. Louis was beside her, his arm around her shoulders, his face pale and strained. "She thought she saw someone," he said quickly, his voice tight. "Someone standing in the shadows of the room. But when I looked, there was no one. The door was locked, the windows closed. It must have been a dream." But Carrie Louise shook her head, trembling. No, I saw him, I know I did. He was there, near the foot of the bed. He looked at me, oh, his eyes, so full of hate." Inspector Curry, summoned at once, examined the room with care. The windows were indeed fastened, the door secure. No sign of intrusion could be found. Yet Carrie Louise was not the sort to invent such terror out of nothing. Her fright had been real, her conviction absolute. Miss Marple stood quietly to one side, watching Louis as he soothed his wife, murmuring reassurances, insisting she had dreamed it. There was too much eagerness in his denial, too much insistence that it had not happened. She filed the observation away in her orderly mind. The next morning, tension in the house reached breaking point. Inspector Curry gathered them all once more in the library, his voice hard. We are dealing not only with a murder but with continued interference, attempts at intimidation and theft of vital papers. Whoever is responsible believes himself clever enough to evade justice, but I assure you he will not succeed. The law has a long reach, and the truth has a way of surfacing. His eyes swept the room, lingering on each face in turn. No one spoke, but the silence was heavy with unspoken thoughts. Miss Marple sat serenely, her hands folded in her lap. She had seen enough to know that the play was moving toward its climax. The murderer had already acted once, and now he was driven to act again, compelled by fear of exposure. It would not be long before he revealed himself fully, forced into the open by the very secrets he had tried so desperately to conceal. And as she looked about the room, at the pale face of Carrie Louise, the anxious glance of Gina, the dark frown of Walter, the smug poise of Alex, and the carefully controlled calm of Louis Sericold, Miss Marple knew the answer lay before her. The threads were tightening, the mask was slipping. Very soon the truth would burst through and the endgame would begin. The atmosphere in Stonygates by the time the sun rose upon the 10th day since Christian Gulbranson's arrival had changed into something taut and nearly unbearable. The house had grown hushed in its movements, with servants treading more quietly than usual, guests keeping their voices subdued, and a constant, almost visible tension stretching across every room. The echoes of Carrie Louise's terror from the night before still clung to the walls, and though Louis had spoken firmly, dismissing her vision as a dream, none who heard her scream could wholly convince themselves it was nothing more than imagination. Miss Marple, who had risen before the rest, sat in a quiet corner of the morning room with her knitting. The clack of her needles was soft, steady, unhurried, but behind her eyes the mind was busy. She saw the drama now as one might see a tapestry, scattered threads at first confusing in their tangle, but slowly, pattern emerging. What Gulbranson had brought to light, the papers he carried, had been the hinge on which the whole matter turned. Someone in that household had seen in those papers not just words, but danger, exposure, ruin, and that someone had killed to prevent their being revealed. Yet murder, Miss Marple knew, was never a single act. Once the blood was spilled, the consequences rippled outward. And always, always the truth edged nearer. She set down her knitting, folded neatly upon her lap, and gazed out the window where the garden lay silvered with dew. The stillness there, the serenity of the roses opening to the morning, was deceptive. Within the house everything was quickening toward a crisis. Inspector Curry appeared shortly afterward, summoned to the breakfast table by Louis, who insisted that the matter could not be left to drag on much longer. His calm tone, his well-measured phrases, his quiet authority, it was all precisely as one might expect of Louis Sericold. And yet Miss Marple, with her instinct for human truth, felt in those very qualities a shade too much control, too much effort. The inspector addressed the household once again, his voice firmer now. I have conducted my inquiries and received reports from London regarding Gulbranson's purpose in coming here. He was not making a social call. He came to confront certain matters within this household: financial irregularities, accusations of manipulation, concerns for the safety of Mrs. Sericold. These were grave charges, and he carried with him evidence to support them. Those papers are missing. Whoever took them, I believe, is the very one who killed him. There was a stir among those present. Gina looked stricken. Walter's fists clenched. Alex gave his careless shrug, while Carrie Louise sat bewildered, her hand resting upon her husband's arm, as though drawing strength from him. Louis rose at once. Inspector, this is intolerable. These hints, these insinuations directed at my household and my work. Christian may have misunderstood matters. He was an old man, not always sound in judgment. But to cast suspicion on us all, to suggest theft and murder, is disgraceful. His voice was even, his words carefully chosen, but his eyes flashed in a way that did not escape Miss Marple. She bent her head, her lips tightening slightly, for in that flash of anger she had glimpsed the truth. Inspector Curry did not answer at once, but looked around the table. Murder is always disgraceful, Mr. Sericold, and yet it has been committed. Until I discover who is guilty, I must cast suspicion where it falls. The day dragged forward. The inspector and his men searched again, going through drawers, cupboards, even the cellars. Questions were asked anew, old answers re-examined, contradictions noted. The servants muttered in corners, and the younger inmates of Stonygates whispered nervously, their voices carrying strange hints of resentment, as though they too suspected more than they dared to say. Miss Marple wandered quietly from room to room, her presence so unassuming that few noticed how keenly her eyes observed. In the conservatory, she noted a small smear of ash upon the tiles, too fine for a cigar or cigarette. It was the delicate residue of paper burned. In the library, she stood by the desk and imagined Gulbrandsen seated there, the papers in his hand, the moment before the shot rang out. She pictured how the killer had moved, how the weapon had been readied, how every detail had been calculated. And in her mind, the figure that acted was no longer shrouded in ambiguity. That evening, as the household gathered once more, Carrie Louise pale but determined, Gina restless, Walter heavy with suspicion, Alex too sleek by half, and Louis ever calm, Miss Marple asked quietly if she might say a few words. Her gentle voice held a firmness that made all turn toward her. "It is not my place," she began, "to interfere in police matters, but I have lived long enough to see certain patterns repeat themselves. When one has spent one's life in a small village, one sees very much, though others may think it little. Murder is rare, but human weakness is not, and often the one explains the other. I believe that what happened to poor Christian Gulbrandsen was the natural consequence of fears and ambitions that have been growing here for some time." Louis shifted slightly, but did not interrupt. Miss Marple continued, her eyes moving gently across the group. "Gulbrandsen came here because he was anxious for his sister, Carrie Louise. He feared she was in danger. That is the most important thing to understand. The danger was not from any external enemy, not from the unfortunate boys housed here, but from someone very close to her indeed. Someone who, in his care for her, sought to control her utterly, someone who, faced with discovery, silenced her brother to protect himself." Carrie Louise gave a faint cry, looking up at her husband in bewilderment. "Louis? No, surely not Louis." Louis laughed softly, though his face had grown pale. "My dear Jane, you spin fantasies. Do you truly imagine that I would kill your brother? For what possible reason?" Miss Marple's eyes rested on him with mild firmness. "Because the papers Gulbrandsen carried would have revealed how you were misusing your trust. You were not serving this house nor your charitable mission but yourself. Funds were diverted, accounts manipulated. Gulbrandsen had discovered the truth. You killed him to prevent his speaking, and afterward you burned the evidence, but not carefully enough. There is ash in the conservatory to prove it." There was silence. The others stared in shock. Carrie Louise's lips moved soundlessly, her hand clutching at the arm of her chair. Walter half rose, then sat heavily down again. Louis's calm cracked at last. His voice, low and harsh, rang through the room. "And what would you know of such things, old woman? You with your knitting and your gossiping village ways. Do you think you can prove a word of it?" Miss Marple's answer was quiet, almost tender. "One does not need proof when one knows how people behave. You always spoke for Carrie Louise, always intercepted her words, always answered for her. You meant to keep her dependent, isolated, believing only in you. And when her brother came to interfere, you removed him. But you cannot remove the truth, Mr. Saracold. It is already too clear." Inspector Curry stepped forward then, his voice sharp. "That will do, Saracold. I believe Miss Marple has given us the final key. We shall find the rest of the proof soon enough." For a moment Louis stood very still, his eyes blazing, his hands clenched. Then slowly, he sank into a chair, his composure returning in fragments, though it no longer concealed what had been revealed. Carrie Louise covered her face with her hands. Gina wept silently. Alex, for once, had no careless remark. Walter muttered darkly under his breath. Miss Marple sat quietly, her work done, her knitting once more in her lap. The storm had broken. The truth was laid bare, and though sorrow would linger at Stonygates and wounds would not heal quickly, justice had found its way at last.